The Nutcracker once again found himself standing on a fireplace mantel. Another mantel in yet another home. Many times during the holiday season, he had stood guard on countless mantels and shelves in so many homes he had lost count. Once the season was over, he'd be packed into a box amongst various ornaments until the following Thanksgiving. This year would prove to be one that would test his skills as a guardian. He was very proud of his service record. He had served the Romanov family many years after he was first assigned to duty in Russia. A revolution had occurred in his homeland, and he had been packed into the only bag of the young Duchess Maria when the family fled Russia. The family eventually found themselves in France, where the Nutcracker had finally been given a new mantel post. Several years later, the Nutcracker found himself in the middle of another conflict as the Germans invaded France. The Duchess's husband was forced to fight for the Germans and died a prisoner of the Soviets. When the Duchess died a few years after the war, one of her daughters took possession of the Nutcracker, and he received a new post in a land once called Yugoslavia. He remained there, but had several postings during this time, as he was passed down through the family over the years. In the 1980s, another revolution occurred, and this time when the Nutcracker was finally unpacked again after being boxed and shipped when his family escaped the conflict, he found himself not only in a new land, but on a new continent. The family he had been serving had fled to the United States of America. It was there that the Nutcracker saw his darkest years. He was eventually discarded by his family and found himself in a thrift store. He was purchased by another family, but when he received his post that year, the Nutcracker realized that his days of serving in royal houses had come to an end. The family that he had served eventually moved from the bustling coastal city they lived in to a hot, dry city in the southwest. Not long after the move, the family would celebrate its first holiday season in their new home, and the Nutcracker received his first post that was not on a mantel, as this house had no fireplace. Instead, the Nutcracker was placed on a shelf next to the family television set, an act that would result in the Nutcracker losing his assignment with his current family. The family matriarch was watching a show about antique appraisals on the television. One of the items brought onto the show for appraisal was another Nutcracker. The Nutcracker recognized the one on the television show. It was one of his brothers-in-arms, who had been assigned to a different member of the Romanov family many years ago in Russia. The Nutcracker was sold to an antique shop whose owner was excited to display what he called a piece of Russian history. However, none of the shop owner's customers seemed to share his enthusiasm for the value of the Nutcracker. So the Nutcracker was forced to accept his new annual post on a display shelf in the antique shop for several years. Every year, the shop owner would put out his holiday items for display, and every year, he would lower the price of the Nutcracker before placing him on the shelf. Until finally, a young couple entered the shop, searching for a holiday decoration for their new home. It was the woman who first spotted the Nutcracker. She picked him up and showed him to her husband excitedly. After looking at the price tag, the young man was hesitant, but his wife was able to convince him to purchase the Nutcracker. When the couple got home, the Nutcracker found himself assigned to a post he had never before spent the holiday season standing on, as the couple set him on a bistro table in the smallest home he had ever served. Over the years, the couple prospered and eventually purchased a large home in the Greenhaven Ranch subdivision. That holiday season, the Nutcracker was happy to receive his new post. He was once again on a mantel in a home that appeared to belong to royalty, though it was much smaller than the palaces he had once served in Europe. Over time, the family grew. The Nutcracker happily watched each holiday, as eventually the home was filled with 3 children. The Nutcracker proudly served this family for years in the house of Thompson. Through all of his years of service to different families and houses, Through all his world travels and all the wars and conflicts that he had witnessed, the Nutcracker had stood his post without ever having to face the adversary that he was trained to defend against, until one year when the Thompsons brought that adversary into their own home. The Nutcracker could not believe his eyes when he saw the Thompsons bring it into the house. These beings had been terrorizing families for millennia, and had been known by many names and taken many forms. This particular creature belonged to a lineage that preferred to cause mischief during the holiday season, so that it may be interpreted as whimsical. A species that was ages old and had assumed this cute, playful form years ago when they performed the ultimate act of mischief. They tricked modern mortals into believing that they were something they were not, a form that would allow them to perform their deeds in the modern world without being detected, a form the mortals had come to call elf on a shelf. The Nutcracker had never seen his sworn enemy take the form of one of these elves, but he was well versed in how to spot them. He detected the elf immediately and was appalled when the Thompsons placed the elf near the top of their Christmas tree. The Nutcracker also knew the elf's eyes were keen, and it undoubtedly also recognized him for what he truly was, a guardian. The sole purpose of the guardians was to protect mortal families from these mischievous elves. After all these years, and the many different families he'd served and posts he had kept watch over, the Nutcracker knew that he had to fulfill his intended duty. The elf on a shelf had to be eliminated. Both the Nutcracker and the elf on a shelf were bound by the laws of the Fae. One of the strictest of these laws was that Fae were forbidden from revealing themselves to mortal humans. The laws were enacted by the Council of Fae centuries before, when the ones from beyond the sky had begun to give their technologies to the mortals. The Council knew that if all of their kind were to survive once mortals had the ability to detect them, the laws were necessary. The Council also knew, however, that the Fae could not be stopped from doing the things they do. This is when other measures were taken to ensure certain lineages of Fae be kept in line. The Fae used their magic to create different types of what they called sentinels. Each sentinel was designed to protect mortals from the most rebellious types of Fae. The Guardians were one of the Sentinel Corps. That first night, after the Thompson family had retired for their nightly rest, the Nutcracker made his move. He waited until he heard no other sounds from the Thompsons save for their slumbering breaths. He detached his boots from his base and slowly made his way across the mantle until he was close enough to the tree to strike. The Nutcracker leapt from the mantle and raised his musket above his head. He thrusted his bayonet into the tree as he landed, but alas, the elf on a shelf was not where it had been placed. The Nutcracker looked around the room, but did not see the elf. He shoved his head into the interior of the Christmas tree to see if he could spot the elf hiding amongst the lights and bulbs, but it was not there. The Nutcracker looked around what he could see of the house from his vantage point, but still saw no sign of the elf on a shelf. The Nutcracker was a skilled hunter, though, and he leapt from the tree and landed on the coffee table that sat in the center of the living room. He listened carefully to make sure the Thompsons still slept. Then he began looking for tracks that the elf may have left behind. It took the Nutcracker much longer to pick up the elf's trail than he thought it should, as the elf proved to be a clever foe. But eventually, the elf made a mistake. The Nutcracker had found some of the white fur that lined the elf's attire and tracked the elf to the den near the front foyer of the house. As he searched for the elf grew nervous as the Nutcracker drew close and decided to try to evade him. As the Nutcracker searched beneath a china cabinet, the elf ran for it, but as it attempted to reach the kitchen, its cloth feet slipped on the tile floor, and it slid into the butcher block. The Nutcracker heard and pursued relentlessly. The elf on a shelf hastened to climb on one of the bar stools that sat next to the butcher block as the Nutcracker charged with his bayonet. The nimble elf quickly made his way atop the butcher block. as the not-so-agile Nutcracker began climbing the stool in pursuit. As the Nutcracker neared the top, the elf desperately ran and jumped from the butcher block with all his might, and was just able to grab the bars of the chandelier that hung above the dining room table. The Nutcracker pulled himself onto the butcher block and cursed the elf that now dangled from the chandelier. The Nutcracker knew he had to pursue, and as he took a few steps back, preparing to make the same leap the elf had, he heard a noise coming from one of the children's rooms. The Nutcracker looked up at the elf and again cursed at it before jumping toward the living room and quickly climbing up the Christmas tree. The Nutcracker quickly scurried across the mantel and placed his boots back onto his base, just in time as the Thompson child named Madison exited the hallway on her way to the kitchen. The Nutcracker carefully glanced toward the dining room and saw that the elf on a shelf had pulled itself up and now sat upon the chandelier. The child reached into the cupboard and retrieved a small plastic tumbler. She filled the tumbler halfway from the drinking water spigot attached to the sink. She turned around, and as she took a drink, when she did, she saw something that startled her. The child instinctively jumped back at the shock and slammed into the countertop sink area. Her elbow hit the cupboard, which knocked the tumbler out of her hand. The cup hit the floor and made a loud noise. Spilling water all over the floor, the Thompson matriarch, Simone, heard the commotion and darted out of bed to see what had happened. She ran to the kitchen and found her child still leaning against the sink. She asked the child, "Are you okay? What's wrong?" The child pointed and replied, "It moved." The mother turned to see what her daughter was pointing at. Over the dining room table, sitting on the chandelier, was the elf on a shelf. The rest of the Thompson family quickly entered the room, and the family began debating how the elf had gotten where it was. The mortal family was unable to detect that the two fae were now glaring at each other. The elf's mischief and the Nutcracker's pursuit almost revealed their true nature to the family. Both knew that this holiday season had now become a fight for survival. The game of hunter and hunted would go on for several nights as the elf continued to evade the Nutcracker. Each night the Nutcracker would hunt the elf, but the clever elf seemed able to evade him no matter what he did. Each night the Nutcracker would pursue the elf until morning, and the awakening of the family members interrupted. Then the Nutcracker would retreat to his post, and the elf on a shelf would remain hidden until one of the family members happened upon its hiding spot. This angered the Nutcracker. He wondered if his years of inactivity, only watching post after post without ever having to face an invasion, had caused him to lose the edge his training had given him. One night, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson were invited to attend the annual holiday gala that Mr. Thompson's employers held at the Greenhaven Country Club. They contacted a young woman they called Emma to watch over the Thompson children whilst they attended the event. When the Nutcracker heard this, he began watching the elf on a shelf closely. He knew that these troublemaker elves were particularly mischievous when an outsider entered the home. He had to keep his guard up to make sure no harm came to the children or Emma while the Thompsons were out of the home. The young lady arrived, and after a brief conversation with the Thompsons, they were off to their party, and Emma gathered the children to entertain them. The Nutcracker kept a careful watch as the children's evening with their caretaker Emma consisted of video games for the boys and makeup for the girl, followed by a movie they all watched together. When the children grew tired, the young lady got them up and ready for bed. As the sitter took the two younger children to their bedrooms, the oldest turned the video game back on. The Nutcracker was busy watching the sitter escort the younger ones down the hallway, and didn't see this happen. Instead, he was surprised by the noise of the game as Taylor began playing. The ruckus distracted him momentarily, and when he looked over at the Christmas tree, he realized that the elf on a shelf was no longer in it. He scanned the room looking for it and just got a glimpse of the red flash as it darted behind the kitchen island. The Nutcracker knew that the elf had ill intentions, and that he had to go after it, but he needed to wait for his opportunity so as not to reveal himself to the mortals. The young lady returned from putting the younger children to bed and told the eldest that he could finish the current portion of his game before going to bed himself. The Nutcracker watched her reach into her handbag and retrieve her mobile communication device. He knew this was his chance to pursue the elf unseen, as the elder child and the sitter were both distracted by their electronic devices. He quickly detached from his post and leapt into the Christmas tree. He paused for a moment to make sure the mortals were both still distracted, and then he leapt from the tree to the dining room table. The young lady's purse was sitting on the table, and the Nutcracker decided to duck into it to hide for a moment and check to make sure that the mortals still weren't watching. Unfortunately, the sitter, only moments later, reached into her purse to place the video game she had brought for the boys away. The Nutcracker laid motionless, but still feared he would be discovered. To his surprise, the young lady didn't even notice him. Instead, she attempted to put her mobile device back in the purse upon placing the video game in it, and was distracted by a message she received. She turned her back to the table to answer the message, and the Nutcracker used the opportunity to move. He leapt from her purse to the kitchen floor, but as he did, he accidentally knocked the video game case from the purse, and it fell to the floor with him. He pushed it, and it slid to the side of the butcher block kitchen island that faced the kitchen sink. Then he headed that way himself as he watched the young lady texting. When he rounded the corner, he had seen the elf dart behind. There was no sign of the elf. He scanned the area, attempted to determine where the elf had gone, but had to pause and freeze next to the video game case with his back against the kitchen island when the sitter came around the other end of the kitchen island. The Nutcracker again feared he'd be discovered, but somehow the young lady did not even notice him standing there on the floor. She was focused on cleaning up the dishes that she and the children had used to eat their dinner and paid no attention to him. Suddenly, the young lady cried out in dismay as a gold ring she wore on her finger slipped off and fell in the kitchen sink. The Nutcracker watched as she contemplated how she was going to retrieve the ring. The young lady was then distracted by the eldest Thompson child, as he asked if he could play the video game one more time before bed. The sitter told him that he'd had his turn and it was time, and she attempted to get the boy to go to bed and walked into the living room to talk to him. While she was distracted, the Nutcracker took the opportunity to continue the search for the elf on a shelf. His hunting skills were keen, and when he spotted a tiny piece of red felt, he knew where the elf had hidden. The Nutcracker approached the cabinet that was directly beneath the kitchen sink and pulled one of the doors partially open. He peered into the cabinet, but did not see the elf at first. He poked his head through the opening cabinet door to peek inside of the rest of the cabinet, but when he did, the elf wrapped his sewn-together arms over the Nutcracker's head and around his neck. The elf pulled the Nutcracker into the cabinet, and the door closed behind. A struggle ensued inside the cabinet as the Nutcracker dropped his musket, and the two began to grapple for position. Their struggle was paused, however, when the cabinet door opened. The two froze in their position as one of the cabinet doors opened and the sitter reached in and unplugged the garbage disposal. The cabinet door closed again, and the two little fighters waited for a moment to make sure they would not be seen by the mortal. Suddenly, the elf on a shelf released its grip on the Nutcracker and ran for the garbage disposal plug. The elf picked up the plug, and as it attempted to place it back into the electrical socket, it was tackled by the Nutcracker. The two continued to grapple for a few moments, and as they did, the Nutcracker realized that despite his combat training, his stiff wooden limbs were not ideal for wrestling with the very flexible elf on a shelf. The elf was able to knock the Nutcracker down, and when he fell, the elf quickly picked up the garbage disposal plug and shoved it back into the outlet. The two heard the sitter scream, and the Nutcracker, back standing, lunged at the elf, but clever elf was able to hang from the plug and deliver a well-timed double kick, knocking the Nutcracker across the cabinet and again off his feet. Suddenly, the whirring garbage disposal turned off, and both little creatures knew that the sitter had turned off the switch. They heard the sitter instructing one of the children to return to bed. Then they both froze where they were, and one of the cabinet doors opened. The elf on a shelf was resting underneath the garbage disposal plug when the young lady looked under the cabinet. She wasn't expecting to see the elf, and it startled her. She jumped backward, and when she did, she stepped on the video game case that the Nutcracker had unintentionally knocked to the floor, pushed there to hide. She slipped on the case and lost her footing. The back of her head struck the butcher block, and she fell to the floor. A sickening crack could be heard as her elbow took the brunt of her fall. The elf moved quickly and scurried from under the cabinet. The Nutcracker picked himself up and moved to pursue, but when he exited the cabinet, he stopped when he saw the young lady on the floor. A pool of blood was gathering beneath her head. The Nutcracker was angered. The elf's tomfoolery had resulted in what appeared to be a mortal casualty. The Nutcracker heard the elf ascending the Christmas tree and was about to pursue again when he heard one of the Thompson children calling out for the sitter. He thought it best if he returned to his post to avoid detection, and as he made his way there, he saw that the elf on a shelf had returned to his spot in the tree. The Thompson child they called Madison emerged from the hallway and began searching for the sitter. The Nutcracker climbed back up to his mantel post and replaced himself on his base. He looked toward the kitchen just as the child discovered the sitter lying on the kitchen floor. She cried out the sitter's name and then ran to one of the drawers in the kitchen and opened it. Inside the drawer was an emergency mobile phone that the Thompsons kept for situations like this. The child used the phone, and the Nutcracker listened in as the child said over the phone, "Mommy, Emma's on the floor bleeding." Some time passed, and the Nutcracker's relentless pursuit of the elf on a shelf continued on a nightly basis, but the cunning elf continued to elude the Nutcracker. The Nutcracker grew increasingly hostile with each night as his pursuit of the elf became an obsession. He vowed that he would avenge the young girl, Emma, and put an end to not just the elf's trickery, but to the elf itself. One evening, the Thompson family left the house together, and the Nutcracker thought it was his opportunity to finally stop the elf. The Nutcracker and the elf on a shelf had both heard the family talking about going to ride the Christmas Express, so they both knew the entire family would be gone for a while. To both, it seemed like their confrontation that night was imminent. The family left, and the two enemies waited to make sure they were gone just as the Nutcracker thought he was about to make the first move. The elf on a shelf jumped down from the tree and scurried across the living room. The Nutcracker groaned angrily and detached himself from his base. He too jumped down from his perch and began to hunt the elf. The family was gone for quite some time, and the game of cat and mouse between the Nutcracker and the elf on a shelf went on nearly the entire time. But the game was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. The doorbell rang and surprised both the Nutcracker and the elf on a shelf. They both ducked and hid where they were and waited for a moment. Someone outside tried to open the front door, but it was locked. Then the Nutcracker could see a shadow as the person outside attempted to look into the front windows, one by one. He heard a commotion outside as it sounded like the person had tripped and struggled to regain their feet. A few moments later, the noise ceased and the Nutcracker heard the gate on the side of the house by the garage open. When he heard that, the Nutcracker realized what was happening. There was a mortal home invader outside, attempting to break into the house. The Nutcracker was already enraged by his hunt for the elf this evening, and this mortal trying to break in would try his patience. He was sworn to protect the home, though, and a mortal breaking in could be just as dangerous to the family as the elf. The Nutcracker thought to himself that he must perform his duty and eliminate the threat. The Nutcracker heard the intruder in the backyard and peered from his hiding place to see the shadow outside looking through the kitchen and dining room windows. The intruder called out for the Thompsons, which confused the Nutcracker. Did the intruder know the family? The voice was from a male, and the Nutcracker thought if the intruder did know the Thompsons, he may be someone attempting to take advantage of the family being away from the home. He thought to himself, How could someone the family knew do that to them? Break into their house during the holidays? It angered the Nutcracker further when the man outside attempted to open the locked back door. The Nutcracker had been hiding on a bookshelf and jumped down from his perch. When he did, the sound of his wooden feet hitting the tile floor resonated through the inside of the house. He saw the shadow outside peer into one of the back windows again and stopped in his tracks. Suddenly, the elf on a shelf darted from his hiding place in the foyer and ran into a hall table in the process. The picture frame atop the hall table fell over from the blow as the elf ran down the hallway toward the children's rooms. Outside, the home invader heard and began working his way around the back side of the house, attempting to peer into the bedroom windows of the children. Inside, the Nutcracker ran to pursue the elf but stopped when he reached the end of the hallway, as he did not know which of the children's rooms the elf had ducked into. As he debated which room to search, the Nutcracker could see the shadow outside attempting to peer into one of the children's bedrooms, and he was reminded that the home was facing an attack from the outside as well. He decided to leave the elf for another time, and he darted for the back door of the house. He quickly climbed up the dining room table and leapt for the back door handle. He caught himself on the door handle, which was only a thumb latch, but had a deadbolt that was locked. He held on with one hand while he used the butt of his musket to push the deadbolt until it unlocked. Then he grabbed the musket with both hands and used it to pull down the thumb latch and open the door. He dropped to the floor and squeezed out the back door before the spring-loaded hinge swung it shut. The door slammed closed and the home invader heard from the side of the house and decided to investigate. The home invader peeked around the corner but saw no one. The Nutcracker had taken cover in the darkness of the patio furniture and watched closely. The invader stood and called out, "Mr. Thompson? Mrs. Thompson?" But of course received no reply. He made his way back to the patio and looked into one of the windows but saw nothing inside. The Nutcracker watched as the home invader reached for the door and tried the knob. He opened the door a little, and the Nutcracker knew that he could not allow the invader inside the family home, so he created a diversion. He used his musket to bang on the side of the barbecue grill that he was hiding under. The invader turned when he heard the noise. While the invader was distracted, the Nutcracker watched in rage as the elf on a shelf snuck out the back door of the house before the invader let go of the knob and the door closed again. The home invader began walking around the patio, searching for whatever had made the noise. The Nutcracker watched the elf scurry across the backyard and hid in some bushes. The home invader called out, "Kitty, kitty," but there was no cat. The home invader approached the barbecue grill and began circling it, looking for what he did not know. The Nutcracker did his best to maneuver himself into a position that he could use to take the invader down. He finally got his chance as the invader continued to circle the grill, and he charged at the intruder. In his haste of hiding in the dark and unfamiliar surroundings, however, the Nutcracker had gotten his beard caught on one of the screws that held the grill stand together, and it ripped from his face. He winced but could not stop his charge. He swung his musket like a war club and struck the invader in the back of the ankle. The invader grabbed his ankle in agony and looked around for what could have hit him, but saw nothing again. He sat for a moment writhing in pain before he tried to stand back up. Unfortunately, he could not stand. The pain in his ankle was far too intense and his right leg had no strength. He stumbled, and as he attempted to catch his balance, he tripped over one of the cables that tethered the barbecue canopy to the ground. He stumbled again, and as he attempted to stomp down with his right foot to stabilize himself, he screamed in pain as he fell over into the swimming pool. He fell into the shallow end of the swimming pool, and he was able to stand on his one good foot once he got his wits about him. His head broke the surface of the water, and he spit out the water that was in his mouth. He looked around and called out again and made his way to the edge of the pool. As he attempted to figure out what had happened, the Nutcracker was waiting on the pool deck. The Nutcracker swung his musket again and struck the invader in the temple. The invader went limp, and before he sank into the swimming pool, the Nutcracker grabbed him by the collar and dragged him out of the swimming pool with all his might in his little wooden body. He dragged the invader across the backyard toward the back gate. Behind the house, on the other side of the gate, was a man-made lake. the Nutcracker reached the gate and let go of the invader. He jumped up and pushed the gate latch with his musket. Then he dragged the invader through the back gate and pushed him into the lake. The Nutcracker made his way back across the backyard, proud that he had disposed of the home invader. Then he realized he now faced a new problem. The inside of the door had a thumb latch, but the outside had a knob, one that he could not turn. As he debated the dilemma, he heard laughter coming from above him. He looked up, and atop the shade canopy that sat over the barbecue grill sat the elf on a shelf. The next day was Christmas Eve, and the Thompson parents were awakened to the doorbell ringing. They answered the door to find 2 police detectives waiting. The Nutcracker heard the doorbell, but he was still outside in the backyard. The elf on a shelf was still sitting atop the canopy that covered the barbecue grill. The Nutcracker had attempted to climb the canopy to pursue the elf, but his thick wooden hands would not allow him to climb the thin nylon cords that secured it, or the slick metal legs that it stood upon. The elf had spent the night laughing at the Nutcracker as it watched him attempt to climb. The Nutcracker now hid beneath a bush, close to the back door, hoping for an opportunity to get back inside. After some time, the opportunity came. The Thompson father walked out onto the back patio. He didn't close the door behind him, but just let go of it, and when he did, the Nutcracker noted that he appeared to be searching for something, and he used the father's preoccupation as a distraction to sneak in the back door. Once inside, the Nutcracker listened for the rest of the family and realized that the mother wasn't with the children down the hallway. He quickly scaled the Christmas tree and retook his post on his base. A few moments later, the Thompson mother joined her husband outside. They both searched for something, and the Nutcracker could not hear their conversation. He hoped that the couple was not searching for the elf on a shelf. If the elf could not get back into the house, the Nutcracker could consider his job complete. Unfortunately, his hopes would go unfulfilled when the Thompsons re-entered the house. The Nutcracker immediately noticed that the father was carrying the elf on a shelf. The Thompsons checked the Christmas tree to verify that the elf they had brought in from outside was theirs. The Nutcracker listened in as they discussed how the elf had gotten outside. They discussed the home invader. The Nutcracker was shocked to find out that the invader had been the suitor of the young lady babysitter, Emma. The Nutcracker did not feel remorse for what he had done to the invader, however. He was doing his duty to protect the home. The Thompson children entered the room and inquired about why the parents were holding the elf. The parents concocted a story. Much of the day after that, the Thompsons tried to make the most of the holiday, despite the bad news. The mother and children spent the day watching holiday movies and baking all manner of sweets, including the chocolate chip cookies that the children would leave for Santa that night. It wasn't the mother and children that the Nutcracker observed all day, though. The Nutcracker noticed that the Thompson father was busy much of the day as well. He was acting odd and kept coming in and out of the parents' bedroom. When Mom and the children were baking the cookies, the Nutcracker heard the father step outside through the garage. When the father returned, he pulled his wife aside to tell her something, and the Nutcracker did his best to listen in. He overheard them saying that the father had spoken to the 2 police detectives again. They were told that the babysitter, Emma, had awakened from her comatose state, and they made plans to take the children to visit her. The Nutcracker knew that when the family left, he would have another opportunity to hunt the elf on a shelf. He looked over at the elf and the Christmas tree, fully knowing the elf also knew this. When the family exited the house to the garage, the Nutcracker listened carefully for the sound of the garage door closing and the family car driving away. This time he did not hesitate. As soon as he knew the family was gone, he detached his boots from his base and looked over at the tree. The clever elf was still 1 step ahead of him and had already begun descending the tree. The Nutcracker gave chase, and another game of hunter and hunted ensued and carried on while the family were gone. As keen as the Nutcracker's hunting skills were, the cunning elf always seemed to get the better of him. The game would go on late into the afternoon. As the sun began to set outside and darkness was falling on Christmas Eve, the family returned from their trip to see Emma in the hospital. The Nutcracker had cornered the elf on a shelf on top of the stacked washer and dryer that filled the nook in the master bathroom. The elf was much better at climbing than the Nutcracker, and the garage door began to open as the Nutcracker was formulating a plan to get to the elf before it jumped back down. When the two heard the garage door, they froze where they were. The family entered the house, and the children were told to go to their rooms and put on their Christmas pajamas. They eagerly obliged and ran for their bedrooms. While the children were distracted, the parents began searching the house. The Nutcracker wasn't sure, but he believed that they were probably searching for the elf on a shelf. His suspicions were confirmed when he heard the parents ask if the children had moved the elf. The children sounded frightened when they responded, so the mother told them to go to the kitchen so they could finish frosting the sugar cookies. The Nutcracker looked up toward the top of the machines and thought to himself that he had to finish the elf before they found it, or it would be placed back into the tree. He looked behind the machines and saw an array of cords and hoses that the machines required to operate. He saw an opportunity and began to climb the cords and hoses as quickly and quietly as he could. As the Nutcracker climbed, he heard one of the Thompsons enter the master bedroom and begin searching. Since he was between the machines and the wall behind them, he didn't worry about the Thompsons seeing him moving and kept climbing. Just before reaching the top, he heard the door of the washing machine open and close, followed by the dryer door. The Nutcracker peeked his head over the top of the dryer and saw the elf on a shelf, sitting still to avoid being seen. He pulled himself atop the dryer and stabbed the elf in the back with the bayonet of his musket. The blow pushed the elf forward and it winced from the pain. The Nutcracker thrusted its bayonet into the elf again, knocking it off the top of the machine. He heard a struggle begin, and he knew that the elf had broken the laws of the Fae and revealed itself to whoever was searching the room. The Nutcracker laid down on his belly and began to crawl forward to the edge of the machine so he could try to get a look at what was now happening. Just before he got to the edge, he heard the dryer door slam shut, and then the sound of something beating on the inside of the door. He realized that someone must have put the elf into the dryer. After a few blows, the dryer door swung open, and the Nutcracker peeked over the edge of the machine to take a look. He saw the Thompson father struggling with the elf. The elf had indeed revealed itself as alive and was in full fight for survival with the family patriarch. The Nutcracker laughed to himself at the thought of him being the one to instigate this action. The mother entered the room and rushed to help her husband, and she opened the door of the washing machine, and he tossed the elf inside with force. The mother closed the door and her husband told her, "Turn it on! Hurry, turn it on!" She hit the start button, and as the elf slammed into the glass door, the door latched and the drum began tossing the elf about inside. The Thompsons looked at each other in complete disbelief of what had just happened. The Nutcracker watched from atop the machines as the Thompsons discussed their next move. The father told his wife to take the children away from the house so he could deal with the elf. The Nutcracker knew that the father was not going to have an easy time disposing of the elf, but he was powerless to assist. He had to obey the law of the Fae himself or risk punishment. The mother agreed reluctantly and gathered the children, stating that they were going to look at Christmas lights. When the children asked why the father was not also going, he told them, "I have to stay here and do a video chat with Santa. He texted me and said he needed to make sure that he had the right directions to get to our house." As the Thompson mother was ushering the children into the garage, the Nutcracker took the opportunity to climb down from the machines in an attempt to carefully work his way back to the living room. He heard as the car backed out of the garage and the door began to close. The Thompson father came back into the house and walked down the hallway to the master bedroom. The Nutcracker could hear the father shuffling through some things in the bedroom as he hid behind the machines, peering around the corner. Suddenly, the door of the washing machine opened, and the elf scurried down the hallway, unbeknownst to the Thompson father. When the father had gathered the items he was looking for, he turned to see that the washing machine door was wide open. He searched for the elf and picked up its trail when he saw drips of water on the floor. The father left the room to pursue the elf, and the Nutcracker thought it best if he worked his way back to the living room. The father followed the drip the elf had left into the kitchen. As he searched for the elf, the Nutcracker ran for the den. The father heard a shuffling sound and snapped his head around, but only saw a flash of red enter the den. He walked over to the den and began looking around. Again, a shuffling sound, followed by a tapping sound on the tile behind him. He turned to see another flash of red heading toward the living room. The father carefully walked over to the living room. As he approached, the gas fireplace next to the tree turned on. He stopped in his tracks to reassess his approach. As he considered, the Christmas tree began to rustle. After a moment, he heard a noise that sounded like a piece of wood hit the fireplace tile, and the tree stopped moving. He waited for a moment and then began creeping toward the living room. As he neared the couch, he craned his neck to peer over to see the living room floor. Suddenly, the elf on a shelf leapt from the other side of the couch and landed on his face. The Nutcracker reached his base and fixed his boots as he was helpless to watch from the mantel as the Thompson's father was knocked back a few steps from the impact of the elf. The elf gripped around the father's throat with its legs and began hitting him in the face repeatedly with its arms. The blows didn't hurt, but disoriented him. He thought to himself that the elf felt impossibly heavy as it held on to him. He stumbled around and back into the couch, causing him to tumble over backward onto the living room floor. The elf held its grip as the father laid in the middle of the living room floor. It continued its relentless attack. It continued to swipe at his face with its arms and seemed to be turning its head to focus its permanently positioned eyes on the fireplace. The father swatted and tugged at the elf but could not get to release its grip on its neck. In fact, the harder he fought, the tighter the elf's lock on his throat became, and he was beginning to strangle him. The father began to kick his legs and panic as he fought to get the elf to let go, but was beginning to lose consciousness. As the Nutcracker watched the elf about to end the Thompson father, a man he'd never seen before came running into the living room. He grabbed the Nutcracker off of the mantel and swung it hard, hitting the elf on a shelf. The elf went flying directly into the protective glass of the fireplace and shattered it. The elf landed in the gas-fueled fire and instantly caught ablaze. It began to let out an unnatural squeal as the flames engulfed it. The Thompson father looked up to see Emma's father standing over him. In his hand, he was holding the Nutcracker. Emma's father tossed the Nutcracker onto the couch and crouched down to check on the Thompson father. As he did, the elf leapt out of the fireplace, still ablaze, and lunged toward the two men. The father instinctively swatted it away with his arms, and the elf was knocked into the Christmas tree. The tree then lit up like a candle wick. The carpet and furniture around it quickly caught fire as well. The tree shook as the elf continued its unholy squeals of agony. The tree began to fall over, and Emma's father quickly yanked the Thompson father out of the way. He got to his feet and helped the Thompson father to his. Then the two men ran out the front door. The flames began to engulf the house, and the Nutcracker looked over to see that the elf had fallen victim to the blaze. It laid face down in a burning heap on the living room floor. The Nutcracker knew that he had to escape the blaze himself, lest his wooden body fall victim as well. He climbed over the couch and ran to the kitchen. He climbed the dining room table as the flames were about to reach it, and jumped from the table to the butcher block island. From there, he jumped again into the sink area and turned the water on. On the countertop, sat some dish towels and a roll of paper towels. The Nutcracker quickly wrapped himself in the paper towels and jumped into the sink. He moved around to soak the paper towels in the water, then he pulled the dish towels over him like blankets and laid down under the running water. He held the towels in place as he heard the fire destroying the Thompson house. As he waited for whatever fate laid ahead of him, he couldn't help but think to himself that he had failed at his duties as a guardian. A few days later, the Thompsons arrived at what was left of their home to meet their insurance adjuster. There was a caution tape around the house as it was no longer structurally sound. Luckily, most of the Thompsons' neighbors had been out for Christmas Eve, so they didn't need to evacuate while the firefighters worked. The firefighters were able to keep the blaze from damaging any other homes. The babysitter's family had invited the Thompson family to stay with them until their homeowner's insurance was able to get them into temporary housing while the next steps were taken. as the Thompsons walked around their property with the adjuster. He explained to them how the process was going to work. The group made their way into what was left of the living room when the father's attention was diverted by something he saw lying in the rubble. He walked over to what he saw, and the mother stopped paying attention to the adjuster to see what her husband was doing. The adjuster noticed that neither were paying attention, and so watched curiously. The father moved around a few pieces of debris and picked up what he had seen underneath it. He stood up, turned around, and held up the Nutcracker to show his wife. It was a little dirty, but had somehow survived the fire. The father looked at his wife and said, "This isn't the first time we've had to start from nothing." She smiled and walked over to hug him. As the couple embraced, the father continued to hold the Nutcracker in his hand behind his wife's back. The adjuster smiled and then noticed something about the Nutcracker that the couple had not. He noticed it was missing its little white fabric beard. A few miles away, at the Heritage Funeral Home, the funeral director and his assistant were arriving from a pickup at the Greenhaven Hospital morgue. The medical examiner had performed an autopsy on the babysitter's boyfriend, and the Heritage Funeral Home had been hired to perform the funeral. The hearse arrived at the funeral home, and the director and his assistant got out to unload the body. They opened the back door of the hearse, and the assistant pulled out his logbook. The funeral home had a protocol they followed. They verified the body's identification before loading up and before unloading. The assistant opened his book and scanned down to the proper line. He asked the director, "Okay, read me the name on the toe tag again." The director replied, "Deceased name is Jordan Victor Wolf."